The roar of engines shattered the morning calm like a declaration of war, and as I stood on the ridge above my land, staring down at the endless line of headlights crawling toward my open fields, I knew instantly that HOA Karen had crossed a boundary she would regret for the rest of her life. Because only someone as arrogantly delusional as her could believe she had the right to invite over 500 strangers to camp on private property that had been in my family for generations. Land that I worked, bled for, and protected with a ferocity Karen had underestimated until this very moment. And as I watched cars, trucks, and RVs stream onto the grass like an invading army, their tents and bonfires sprouting in rapid succession, their laughter and music clashing with the stillness of my hills, I felt that old familiar fire rise in my chest, the one that came every time someone tried to take what was mine. And I promised myself before the sun went down that this trespass would not end quietly, because I had seen the flyers Karen posted, online bragging about a community wilderness retreat and a Karen-approved free camping festival, claiming she had secured the land for neighborhood use, even though the deed bore only my name. And the audacity of it made my jaw tighten as I imagined her smug smile, no doubt already parading around with a bullhorn, playing hostess to hundreds of uninvited guests, unaware that I was already formulating the reckoning she had brought upon herself. And the first spark of my plan flickered when I heard the heavy snort of my bulls from the pen below the barn, their dark eyes glinting with restless power, as if they too sensed that an intrusion had begun, that their home was threatened. And I knew then that Karen's party was about to turn into a battlefield. But first I lingered in the shadows, unseen, watching as campers staked claims. Fires crackled, beer cans popped open, children ran wild through my fields, trampling fences and snapping posts. And the sheer violation of it all gnawed at me, until my fingernails dug crescents into my palms, because I could see how carefully orchestrated this invasion had been. Karen at the center of it all, strutting like a general in her red blazer and oversized sunglasses, barking orders about where tents should go, directing pickup trucks to park in neat rows as though she owned the soil beneath their tires. And the sight of her raising a toast to her guests sent a surge of rage through me that nearly made me storm down then and there. But patience, I reminded myself, patience would make the blow land harder. So I stayed cloaked in the tree line, observing, cataloging every offense, every trespasser, every moment that would later serve as undeniable evidence of her crime. Though evidence was not the only thing I intended to deliver, because revenge was a dish that demanded spectacle, and tonight, under the cover of darkness, the spectacle would begin. Yet even as the hours passed and dusk painted the horizon in strokes of crimson, tension rippled through me at every cheer that rose from the encampment, every motorcycle that revved, every chorus of music that spilled across my valley, until the very earth seemed to pulse with an alien rhythm that did not belong here, not on my land. And when Karen climbed atop the hood of an SUV and announced with her bullhorn that this was only the first annual Neighborhood Freedom Festival, promising her mob that she would liberate this land from selfish hands while gesturing vaguely toward the hills where I stood, hidden but listening, I clenched my teeth so hard I could taste iron. And it was in that moment I made my final decision that the bulls would run free tonight, their massive bodies thundering through this circus like a storm breaking chains. But before I acted, I let the darkness descend fully, the fires of Karen's mob glowing like embers against the black canvas of night, their shadows dancing, their laughter rising to drunken crescendos, unaware that eyes watched them from above, eyes that gleamed with the fury of a man whose patience had snapped. And as I made my way down the ridge toward the barn, the bulls snorting louder as if they too sensed the anticipation of battle, I thought only of the chaos that would unfold, of Karen's screams when she realized her illusion of control was crumbling. And as my hand closed around the heavy latch of the pen, heart pounding like a war drum, I whispered to the night that the invasion ended here, on my terms, and when I pulled the gate wide, the cliffhanger began. The night exploded the moment the gate swung wide, because the bulls, massive shadows of muscle and fury, surged into the open with a roar of hooves that shook the earth like rolling thunder. and the sound carried down into the fields where Karen's so-called festival still blazed with firelight and drunken laughter, drowning in music and chaos until suddenly the rhythm shifted, because every head turned toward the hill just as the first bull burst from the dark like a juggernaut of flesh and horn, its bellows slicing through the night like a war trumpet, and the crowd's laughter died in an instant, replaced by shrieks that fractured into hysteria as the herd thundered forward, their silhouettes looming larger with every heartbeat, and I stood just behind them, watching with grim satisfaction as my land itself seemed to rise up against the trespassers, because I had not called the sheriff, I had not filed a complaint, I had not begged for help. I had simply unleashed what was already mine, nature's force bound in sinew and rage, and as the first campers scrambled from their tents, stumbling over their coolers and chairs, scattering drinks and half-cooked food into the dirt, the bulls tore into the encampment like a storm no man could stop, tents collapsing under their weight, bonfires scattering sparks into the night sky, and the screams of hundreds of people filled the valley as Karen's dream of a community wilderness retreat mutated into a nightmare she could not command with her bullhorn, though she tried, her shrill voice screeching above the panic as she shouted at people to stay calm and form an orderly line, as if 500 terrified trespassers could be corralled with words. But every time her voice cut through the chaos, another bull crashed through the camp, scattering bodies in every direction, and her voice turned shriller, weaker, until she dropped the bullhorn altogether and ran herself, clutching her handbag to her chest while shoving aside the very neighbors she had lured here with promises of free camping and open land. And through it all, I stood in the shadows by the barn, arms crossed, feeling the thundering vibrations under my boots, not smiling, not laughing, but grim and silent, because this was not entertainment. It was justice, rough and raw, the kind that left no illusions about who held power here. And yet, even as I watched the carnage, my mind calculated, observing how the mob reacted, where they fled, who tried to fight back, and I noted the cluster of HOA enforcers, Karen's loyal board members, men in polos and reflective vests who had come armed with flashlights and radios, pretending to be some kind of authority, and instead of fleeing, they tried to push the bulls back, waving sticks, yelling at the animals like they were rebellious teenagers. But they underestimated the fury of beasts bred for strength and dominance, and when one bull swung its massive head, a man went flying through the air like a rag doll, landing hard against a cooler that burst open in a spray of ice and beer. And the sight shattered what little courage remained in the others, their radios clattering uselessly as they bolted into the dark, abandoning their neighbors to fend for themselves, and still Karen screamed at them, demanding they protect the community, while she herself cowered behind a toppled table. And the irony of it all burned like acid in my veins, because she had built this moment brick by brick with arrogance. And now her empire was collapsing in a single night of thunder and horn, but the true climax had not yet come, because as the bulls scattered the last of the campers into the tree line, I heard a new sound, not the terrified screams, not the pounding hooves, but the unmistakable wail of sirens in the distance, drawing closer, red and blue lights flashing against the horizon. And for one brief second, Karen's eyes lit up with triumph as she clawed her way atop a picnic bench and shrieked, "Finally! The law is here to arrest this lunatic farmer," pointing wildly toward the hills where she imagined I still stood. But her triumph was premature, because when the first cruisers skidded into the clearing, their spotlights cutting through smoke and dust, the deputies did not rush to her aid, nor did they charge at me. Instead, they leapt from their vehicles, weapons drawn not on me, but on the panicked mob tearing apart private property, shouting commands for everyone to get down, get on the ground, hands in the air, because they knew exactly whose land this was, exactly whose rights had been violated. And Karen's shrieks turned from triumph to outrage as she tried to demand that the deputies arrest me, screaming about neighborhood rights and community ownership. But the deputies ignored her, focusing instead on restoring order to a crowd that no longer looked like innocent neighbors, but trespassers caught in the act. And as I stepped into the glow of their spotlights, calm, steady, and unarmed, the chaos seemed to part like a curtain, all eyes turning toward me. And I knew this confrontation was only beginning, because Karen, wild-eyed and desperate, would not go down without trying to drag me with her. And though the deputy's arrival meant the bulls would soon be corralled, it also meant my battle with her had shifted onto a larger stage, one that would require more than brute force. It would demand cunning, patience, and traps she could not escape. But for now, as Karen lunged forward, finger jabbing at me with venom, and the deputies raised their hands to silence her, I felt the cliffhanger sharpen like a blade, because the night was far from over, and the real war between us had only just begun. If the stampede had been thunder, what followed was lightning striking back in the form of headlines. Because by the next morning, Karen had twisted the night's chaos into a grotesque story of her own invention, one that painted her as the victim and me as a violent landowner who had unleashed wild animals on innocent families. And as I scrolled through the endless flood of articles, shaky phone videos, and Karen's own interviews where she clutched a tissue and wept on camera about neighbors who only wanted to camp under the stars, I realized she had escalated the war to a battlefield she thought she could control. Public opinion, and she wielded it like a blade, slicing at my reputation with every word. But what Karen never understood was that truth, though slower than lies, has a way of cutting deeper when it finally strikes. And I was patient, gathering evidence from security cameras hidden around the property, recording the very flyers she had posted online claiming the land was open for community use, storing testimony from deputies who had seen firsthand the trespass. And yet patience did not silence the gnawing fury as I watched reporters swarm the edge of my land, cameras aimed like weapons, drones buzzing overhead while Karen strutted among them like a queen holding court, her voice ringing with false authority as she called me a danger to the neighborhood, promising lawsuits, demanding that the county strip me of my land rights for the so-called safety of the community. And though the law had not yet moved against me, I could see the cracks forming as pressure mounted from Karen's smear campaign, because neighbors who had once nodded politely at me in town now crossed the street to avoid me, and whispers followed wherever I went, and I could feel the isolation tightening like a noose. But instead of despair, it lit a colder fire inside me, a determination that this war would not be fought only in courts or newspapers, but in shadows where Karen least expected it. So while she paraded before cameras, I worked quietly behind the scenes, compiling every detail of her corruption, her misuse of HOA funds, her manipulation of board members, her underhanded deals to inflate property values at the expense of everyone else. And the more I dug, the more rot I uncovered. But still she struck first, filing a civil suit that accused me of reckless endangerment and emotional distress. A suit so outrageous it might have been laughable had it not been accompanied by a restraining order designed to keep me from even setting foot on certain parts of my own property until the court hearing. And when the notice arrived, I could practically hear Karen's smug laugh echoing through the paper, her belief that she had cornered me at last. But she underestimated two things: my connections and my resolve, because when I showed the deputies the footage of her leading 500 strangers onto my land with her bullhorn, when I revealed the online flyers with her signature and face, their expressions hardened, and though they could not yet dismiss the case, they hinted that Karen's mask was slipping in the eyes of the law. But Karen was relentless, and her retaliation did not stop with the courts. She turned to sabotage, instructing her loyalists on the HOA board to harass me at every turn, sending code enforcement officers to my gates with phantom violations, filing noise complaints whenever my bulls bellowed, even spreading rumors that my land was unsafe, contaminated, unfit for use. And yet through every attack I endured in silence, plotting, documenting, preparing the trap I would soon spring. But what I did not realize was that Karen, cornered by her own crumbling lies, was growing desperate enough to abandon even the facade of legality. And the first sign came one midnight when I heard footsteps outside my barn, soft but hurried, and when I slipped into the shadows with my flashlight off, I caught a glimpse of 3 figures by the fence, men I recognized as Karen's hired enforcers, carrying cans of gasoline, their whispers sharp with intent. and my blood turned to ice not with fear but with rage, as I realized she had escalated to arson. And though I chased them off that night with a warning shot into the dirt, I knew this was not the end, but the beginning of something darker. Because Karen, stripped of her public mask, had revealed her true self, a woman who would burn, sabotage, and even risk lives to destroy me. And as I reinforced the fences, checked the locks, and kept my bulls closer than ever, the night grew heavier with the weight of inevitability. Because she was not done, not by a long shot. And the cliffhanger sharpened when I returned to the farmhouse one late evening and found my front door ajar, the lock broken, the scent of perfume lingering inside, and on the kitchen table a single note scrawled in Karen's hand. "This land will be mine, even if I have to bury you under it." The note Karen had left on my kitchen table was more than a threat. It was a declaration of intent. And as I stood there staring at her jagged handwriting under the pale glow of the farmhouse lantern, I knew this war had moved into its most dangerous stage. Because Karen no longer relied on her board, her fake authority, or her media circus. Now she was stepping into the shadows where law blurred and violence festered. And if I didn't seize control of the battlefield right here, right now, she would burn everything I had built to the ground. But I also knew that in her arrogance she had already given me the key to her undoing. Because leaving that note, breaking into my home, crossing the one threshold she should never have touched, was the mistake that gave me leverage. And leverage was all I needed to turn her own recklessness into the snare that would crush her. So over the next days I moved like a man possessed. Methodical and silent, strengthening locks, installing hidden cameras, burying microphones in fence posts, planting GPS trackers on the HOA's vehicles when they parked too close to my land, and all the while pretending to remain the silent, wounded victim, because the more Karen believed she had me cornered, the sloppier she became. And sure enough, her board meetings turned into open plots against me. Recorded by the bug, I slipped under the lip of their conference table, capturing her rants about how I had to be ruined publicly before the lawsuit failed, capturing her instructing her cronies to vandalize my property again, to plant evidence of animal cruelty in my barns, to bribe inspectors to cite me for violations I hadn't committed, and every vile word poured into my hard drive, a growing arsenal of proof I was saving for the right moment. But even as I gathered this evidence, Karen escalated her campaign in ways that shook the ground beneath my feet. Because twice I caught her men prowling the pastures at night with rifles slung over their shoulders. And though they fled when I fired warning shots, the message was clear. They weren't just after me, they wanted my bulls too, the very beasts who had trampled her illusion of control. And that made the urgency of my plan sharpen into something deadly. Because I would not allow her to lay a hand on them, not after she had already desecrated the land with her mob. So I began weaving a trap layered in both law and spectacle, one that would not just stop her but expose her, strip her bare before the community she claimed to represent. And I began with the simplest piece, bait, because I knew Karen well enough to understand that her ego would never let her ignore a challenge. So I filed a countersuit, quiet and precise, demanding restitution for trespass, damages for vandalism, and the immediate dissolution of her HOA's authority over my property line. And though on the surface it looked like a simple legal defense, it was really a signal flare designed to draw her out. Because Karen's pride could not tolerate resistance. She needed dominance, spectacle, a stage where she could perform her fury. And as expected, she doubled down, summoning her troops to another gathering at the edge of my land. This time a rally with cameras invited. Reporters notified, her bullhorn at the ready, and I let her build it. I let her invite them all. Because while she raged before the cameras about dangerous landowners with no respect for the community, my hidden drones recorded her trespassing yet again. My microphones picked up her board members openly admitting to planting false evidence. And my allies, quiet neighbors she had alienated for years with her petty fines and cruel enforcement, stood by ready to testify. Because the longer Karen ranted, the more rope she wrapped around her own neck, and I could almost see the snare tightening, but this was not enough, not yet. Because to truly destroy her empire, I needed her to overreach, to step so far into the abyss that no judge, no cop, no neighbor could save her. and the opportunity came faster than I expected. Because one night, 3 days before the court hearing, I heard the unmistakable crack of glass in the barn, and when I slipped out with my rifle, keeping low, the moonlight caught 3 shadows inside, the same men I had chased off before, now carrying jugs of gasoline. Their voices tense as they spoke about finishing the job so Karen doesn't have to worry. And instead of firing a warning shot this time, I pressed record on the body cam hidden in my jacket and filmed every second as they sloshed fuel across the hay bales. As they muttered about how, "The old man won't be able to fight once the barn's gone," and my bulls snorted in panic, stamping the ground, their rage contained only by the strength of their pens. And that was the moment I stepped out of the shadows, cocked the rifle, and told them the only way they were leaving was in cuffs or coffins, and the fear that shattered their bravado was almost satisfying. Because when deputies arrived minutes later, summoned by the silent alarm I had installed in the barn, they found everything: the fuel, the footage, the body cam, the trespassers caught red-handed. And though they were hauled off, I knew the real serpent. The one who had sent them still slithered free. Because Karen would never dirty her hands directly, she always used pawns. And yet those pawns had given me something priceless: proof of conspiracy, proof that tied back to her, and still I did not strike, not yet. Because patience was the venom in my trap, and I wanted her to believe she still held the upper hand. So when the news reported the arrests, I let her spin her lies, let her claim they were lone troublemakers, let her call me paranoid, dangerous, unstable, because the deeper she sank into her performance, the harder she would fall when the stage collapsed beneath her feet. But I underestimated just how desperate she had become, because 2 nights before the hearing, I woke to the distant sound of my bulls roaring in terror, a sound so raw it sent me sprinting barefoot across the dirt, rifle in hand, only to find the fence cut clean through. The animals charging in confusion toward the far pasture and standing by the broken posts. Illuminated in the high beams of a waiting truck was Karen herself, hair wild, eyes gleaming with something between fury and madness. And for the first time, she didn't have her board, didn't have cameras, didn't have law on her side. She had come herself, wire cutters in one hand, a pistol glinting in the other. And the sight froze me in place, not with fear, but with the shocking realization that she had finally abandoned every mask, every pretense, and revealed herself for what she was: a predator willing to burn, break, or kill to get what she wanted. And as the bulls thundered past in panic and Karen raised that pistol toward me, the trap I had so carefully set was about to be tested in fire. Because this confrontation was no longer about land or law or even pride. It was survival. And the cliffhanger carved itself into the night with the metallic click of her finger tightening on the trigger. The moment the pistol clicked and the bulls charged past in a thunder of hooves, the war between us shed whatever remained of its rustic physical edges and dropped into a colder, far more dangerous arena, law and mind, because when a woman like Karen realizes brute force will not secure her dominion, she turns to instruments that can grind a man into ash while the rest of the town nods politely and calls it due process. And so I shifted gears, trading shotguns and steel for subpoenas and strategy, knowing that the true end game would not be scored in broken fences but in testimony, precedent, and the slow, excruciating unspooling of her public persona until there was nothing left but raw motive and exposed corruption. And I began with the law because law makes spectacles respectable and makes lies stick to anyone who doesn't know how to handle pressure. And Karen, for all her bluster, depended on people not looking too closely at paper trails, at bank statements, at recorded board votes, and the thin, nervous signatures of men who did whatever she told them to do. And now those signatures were going to be my weapons, my legal artillery, and I began to file, to subpoena, to force the truth into rooms where it could not hide. And the first volley was surgical, a motion to compel production of HOA financials, combined with an emergency petition demanding the preservation of electronic records and video evidence from every event Karen had organized, because you cannot dismantle a queen without showing the court how the throne was built. And the documents arrived like slow lightning, emails and invoices that traced a crooked line from Karen's private accounts to the HOA's coffers, payments disguised as maintenance that flowed instead to staging firms and PR consultants, money used to cultivate sympathy, to manufacture events that would keep her in the headlines and the gullible praising her as some kind of protector while she quietly enriched herself and punished anyone who opposed her rule. And when my lawyers, cautious and precise men who knew how to bend law into a blade, added depositions sworn under oath from deputies who had responded to the stampede, and from the neighbors who had watched their property trampled because Karen had convinced them it was shared, the portrait that emerged was damning. But law is not a single stroke. It is a path of attrition, a patient, meticulous erosion of lies. And so while the subpoenas did their work, I launched the psychological campaign that would finish what the court began. Because people are not moved only by spreadsheets and sworn statements. They are moved by betrayal, by the slow collapse of a story they once believed in. And so I let Karen keep speaking while I turned every phrase of hers into a reflection, an echo that revealed her contradictions like cracks in glass. And I fed that echo into a network of neighbors who had grown tired of fines and petty tyranny, the ones who had complained quietly to me for years about her vendettas and her lists of punishments. And when they saw the invoices and the memos, they finally found voice. And their voices multiplied into a chorus that reporters could not ignore. And before long, the narrative shifted from terrifying farmer to allegations of HOA embezzlement and intimidation, and Karen found herself forced from talk shows into depositions, from bullhorns into conference rooms under harsh fluorescent lights where cameras could not follow, because the courtroom has a way of starving a performance of oxygen until only truth remains. And that starvation was intentional. I wanted her trapped in legal limbo, while the community slowly, irrevocably turned its back because a woman who runs on applause cannot survive silence. And silence is what I planned to deliver, piece by careful piece. But she would not go quietly. She retaliated with the only weapon left to her. Narrative violence dressed as civic duty. She hired a team of lawyers and a charismatic PR specialist who spun the arrests and the subpoenas into an image of oppression, of a man with guns and bulls who had terrorized families enjoying a local event. And the first few headlines landed hard, shaking loose some of the support I had expected, causing one or two reluctant allies to step back and whisper caution. And I felt the ground tremble with the risk that a single, well-delivered lie could undo months of careful work. But experience taught me that lies can be fought with context, that PR can be outmaneuvered by accumulation of fact, and so I poured everything into building an airtight chronology. Timestamps from hidden cameras, cross-referenced GPS pings from the HOA vehicles, call logs showing Karen coordinating with board members and contractors the week before the illegal camping, receipts showing payments to event coordinators for erecting barricades and promoting the festival, and even the voice recordings from meetings in which she explicitly plotted to manufacture community outrage against any dissenters. And when we presented this body of evidence to the court in a compact, devastating bundle, the judge's eyebrows lifted in a way that felt like the slow unfolding of a trapdoor beneath her shoes. But legal victory is not instant. It expands in layers. In parallel to the motion practice, I began a campaign of small, precise psychological operations aimed at the fragile center of Karen's influence, her board, her social circle, her allies who craved status more than truth. And I approached them one by one, not as an enemy, but as a man offering an out, laying bare the evidence in private sessions while offering deals that protected those who cooperated, because you cannot win a battle if you force everyone to fight to the death. You must peel away the support until the core is exposed and alone. And the first to flip was a man who had once been her treasurer, a nervous man who confessed to helping with the books and showed me bank transfers he'd been ordered to label maintenance, and his confession was a scalpel, because it allowed us to subpoena the accounting firm he named and to reveal the shell companies Karen had used to launder money for PR and private events. And with that came emails. And with emails came direct messages where Karen bragged about controlling the narrative, calling dissenters problems that needed soft removal, and the word Soft chilled me because it suggested she was comfortable ending people's reputations and livelihoods without getting her hands dirty, and that comfort was what made her dangerous and what made exposing her necessary. As the court dates multiplied and motions flew like arrows across the system, Karen's demeanor changed in ways visible to everyone who had once idolized her. The sharp red blazers lost their sheen. The fake smiles grew tight, and sleeplessness mapped itself onto her face in the form of dark crescents under her eyes. But glad as I was to see that facade crack, I knew such collapse is not the same as defeat. And so I continued the pressure field. Anonymous letters to local papers highlighting the victims of her fines, discreetly leaked audio of her disparaging longtime neighbors, and a rolling dossier delivered to the county inspector that detailed the very violations she claimed to be policing in others but had been covering up for herself for years. And those leaks stirred a public reckoning that the PR team could not wholly spin into sympathy, because nothing dims the light of truth like 1,000 suppressed voices finally being let out. And with each new name that came forward, with each new account of petty tyranny and illegal fines and retaliatory enforcement, the community's patience thinned until even those who had once attended her neighborhood forums began to look at her as a liability. And liability is the language of power. Once someone becomes a liability, allies slip away like wet leaves. Yet Karen's most dangerous assault was intimately personal and surgical. She tried to break me where documents and deputies could not reach. She exploited the law of perception, hiring social media accounts to circulate edited clips, showing only bulls and chaos with voiceovers accusing me of being unstable. And she crafted a smear so precise that some of my clients and business contacts began to temper their support, worried about association, and the doubt crept in like frost, unseen until it had settled. And there is nothing more lethal than isolation. With isolation, even the strongest men start to doubt their choices. And I felt it too, the temptation to withdraw, to let the courts move slowly and hope for an acquittal in the quiet. But I had learned long ago that passive endurance is the enemy of justice when the opposition plays loudly and without scruple. So I fought back not only with filings and witnesses, but with theater. Carefully staged moments that put Karen's contradictions on display for anyone watching. Like the time we arranged for a local radio host to ask her, live on air, whether the HOA had ever paid for her private events. And her evasive answer was played back in slow loops on social feeds until even the most loyal of her followers could see the hesitation, the crack in her polished armor. Because psychology is simple. Put the truth in front of someone enough times, and their cognitive dissonance will start to resolve toward reality if they have even a shred of integrity. And the court of public opinion, unlike legal courts, is won by repetition and framing, not by brief and technical motions. Still, the pressure I applied had costs. My nights shortened into sleepless stretches of planning. My life fragmented into pieces of strategy and subpoenas. And I watched my own reputation get chewed by the machinery of litigation as Karen's lawyers filed motion after motion alleging harassment and intimidation, trying to tie my undercover recordings to illegality, claiming entrapment. And the legal fight became as much about technique as it was about truth. And we had to be flawless in evidence admission, in chain of custody, in witness preparation, because a single misstep in court could throw out the case and hand her a victory framed as righteous vindication. And so my team and I drilled depositions until every witness was steady. We authenticated every recording. We lined up forensic accountants who could explain the money trail in language judges could not ignore. And we built a narrative that not only told what Karen had done, but why she had done it, exposing motive as the spine of the whole case. Because in the end, law recognizes patterns and motives, and once you can show that someone systematically used power to enrich herself and to silence opposition, the scales start to tip. But even as the legal machinery ground forward, Karen struck back in the darkest way she had yet attempted. A late-night anonymous package slipped under my door, a smear of something on my porch that smelled faintly of petrol and vinegar, and a note with a single line that implied the next move would be blood. And the threat was not idle. It was a promise. And it forced me to consider that while the courtroom could judge her, There were parts of justice that would never be adjudicated if she chose to burn the world down with me still in it. And the cliffhanger that closed this phase of the war was not a single gunshot or a legal order, but a whisper through the grapevine that Karen had filed a secret criminal complaint, naming me as the aggressor in an alleged conspiracy to intimidate HOA members, a complaint lodged with a prosecutor who had political calculations of his own, and the knowledge that a criminal indictment could be engineered overnight sat like an anvil over my head. Because criminal charges change the entire geometry of a fight. They strip rights. They harden juries. They make a man's life a theater of restraint. And as I prepared my next legal brief and plotted the psychological maneuvers that would counter her final gambit, I understood more clearly than ever that the final act had yet to be written, that Section 6 would not be an epilogue but the storm itself. And I readied everything I had, witnesses, documents, allies, and an unbreakable nerve, because Karen was running out of masks and patience, and when the last mask fell, the world would see what she was willing to sacrifice to remain queen. And I would be waiting in the courtroom and in the dark for that moment when law and truth finally converged to decide which of us would be left standing. The courtroom was electric with tension, the air thick with the scent of polished wood, paper, and the quiet hum of anticipation. Because after months of meticulous planning, surveillance, legal maneuvers, and psychological chess, the moment had finally arrived where Karen would face not only the weight of the law, but the collective judgment of a community she had spent years manipulating and terrorizing. And as the judge entered, robe flowing and gavel in hand, every eye in the chamber swung toward her, noting the once pristine red blazer now wrinkled and creased, her hair disheveled in a way that betrayed nights spent pacing and plotting. And she tried, as always, to summon the persona that had deceived so many. A voice loud, confident, commanding, but the effect was hollow, because the walls of the courtroom, lined with witnesses, deputies, neighbors, and allies who had silently endured her tyranny, reflected back only the echoes of her own misdeeds. And the prosecution began with a precision that cut like a scalpel, presenting the full chronology, the flyers inviting trespass, the videos of hundreds of campers trampling my land, the drones, the hidden cameras, the recorded meetings, the financial trail exposing embezzlement, and the sworn testimony of board members who finally, in fear of perjury, admitted to conspiring under her direction. And as each piece of evidence was laid bare, I watched her composure crack incrementally, a flicker in her eyes, a tremble in her fingers as she clutched her notes, desperately flipping pages that no longer protected her from the narrative the law had constructed against her. And yet she was not finished, not by any measure, because Karen's mind moved faster than any courtroom procedure, calculating, spinning, looking for an opening, a loophole, a human error she could exploit, and she launched into a counterattack, weaving a story of false victimhood, portraying herself as the betrayed authority, twisting the language of contracts, deadlines, and property law. But the judge, meticulous and unimpressed, interrupted her, demanding evidence, demanding clarity, and each faltering word from Karen only widened the chasm between her claims and reality. And as the deputies and lawyers presented the recordings of her midnight trespass and sabotage attempts, including the body cam footage of her men in the barn with gasoline, the murmurs in the room swelled, a tide of disbelief and outrage that carried through the gallery. And Karen's face, once so full of arrogance, now twisted in a mixture of fear, fury, and disbelief. And yet, even in that moment of exposure, she clung to one last thread, a secret affidavit she had filed in an off-the-record hearing claiming evidence had been tampered with. A bomb she hoped would detonate and invalidate months of painstaking work. And as her attorney nervously produced the affidavit, shuffling papers and glancing at me with unspoken worry, I felt the familiar thrill of the trap I had so long prepared, because Karen had finally played her card. The card I had been waiting for, but it was not the hand she expected, not the leverage she thought it would be, because my team, anticipating every desperate move, had countered it with forensic documentation, timestamps, and certified recordings proving every chain of custody was intact. And as the judge examined the documents, flipping through digital printouts with a practiced eye, Karen's body language collapsed, shoulders sagging, hands trembling. and a quiet panic spread across her features as she realized the court was no longer a stage for her performance. It was a mirror reflecting her total misdeeds. And even as her defense scrambled to salvage credibility, the prosecution pressed harder, layering motives, threats, and financial improprieties one upon another, like bricks stacking toward an inevitable collapse. And outside, the community watched, media cameras catching every flicker of doubt in her eyes, the whispers of truth spreading faster than any spin she could muster. But Karen, ever the survivor in her own mind, refused to surrender completely, and she cast one last glance at me, a look filled with venom and unyielding defiance, as if to promise that even in defeat she would not go quietly. And then the judge leaned forward, gavel in hand, and as the words "motion granted" echoed, signaling the court's recognition of the evidence and the beginning of the end of her authority. Karen's lips twisted into a snarl, and she whispered something under her breath that made me pause. Because it was neither apology nor acknowledgement. It was a threat. The promise of escalation beyond the court, beyond law, beyond anything we had anticipated. And in that instant, as the deputies escorted her from the room, restrained but eyes blazing, and as the community exhaled, the city seemed to hold its breath, because Karen had left one final seed of uncertainty, one dark hint that while the courts could strip her of titles, fines, and boards, the true measure of her fury might yet find a way to rise from the shadows. And I knew in that split second, as I stepped from the courtroom and felt the weight of justice settling into place around me, that the story was not fully over. Karen's eyes met mine one last time, a silent message carved in venom and promise. And though law and community had dealt her the greatest blow, that gaze, sharp and unbroken, whispered of a reckoning yet to come. A storm that had been paused but not ended, leaving a cliffhanger that no ruling, no victory, no settlement could erase, even defeated. She was still watching and still plotting, and in the quiet that followed the gavel's echo, I realized the war may have ended for now, but in her mind, and perhaps somewhere in the shadows of the world she had built, Karen's next move was already forming.